It's a pleasure for me to be here in front of everybody. I haven't had the chance of being before the civic tech community, but about 6 or so years ago, I worked at City of Toronto at the Civic Innovation Office, and a lot of folks used to come from Civic Tech TO to the open office hours that we had to pitch a lot of ideas. So I think it's a fantastic community, and hopefully what I present here, gets the conversation going. Especially about local democracy in Toronto, which is something that I'm passionate about. So I'm going to present today about local civic engagement, local resident engagement from the bottom up in Toronto, and how local resident groups digitally engage Torontonians. So this quote, which I can't take credit for, "Things move at the speed of trust," I thought was a really interesting quote. That's actually from Alexa Gilmore from Stone Soup, which is a mutual aid society, which I'll talk briefly about. But I think it captures a lot about how you want to actually do some forms of engagement, which is to actually build trust. So just to jump into this for a second, a little bit about myself. So I work as the Deputy Director of the Center for Democracy Innovation, which is at the National Civic League. It's a remote work. It's based in Toronto. I work on American democracy. Ironically, I'm the Canadian trying to help them do a lot of work. But this project specifically is based out of the Future of Canada project at McMaster, and it's specifically based on some of the challenges that I've written about regarding local civic engagement in Toronto. And so, the commonplace or refrain to start from is democracy is in crisis, or is it? And we have challenges. There's some really interesting reports that have come out with the Vital Signs report, with Samara Center for Democracy that has talked a little bit about harassment and abuse in local democracy. So some of the things that they're pointing towards is that social capital is a bit frayed, volunteering is declining, there's polarization, there's a lot of challenges. And on the flip side, what I've written about is that, the way that we've mobilized locally in the city occurs in pockets. It's almost siloed and isolated, but there's a lot of really interesting stuff. One of the big challenges that we had was 2018, 2019, when the mayor amalgamated basically representation in the city. We were set to actually increase local council up by 3 seats. We actually reduced it to 25, thereby decreasing the level of representation in the city. And as a result of that, what was interesting is they created a special committee on governance. 2018, 2019, they accepted delegations from the entire city for people to come and present about what they wanted local democracy to be like. Whole list of very interesting things, which I capture in an article on that screen there, Beyond the Triaging of Neglected Things, which is an open source article. From that, I was really interested in taking that to the next level and thinking about not simply about how people engage locally in person, but what are the digital tools, what are the civic engagement tools that they're leveraging online. So specifically, the goal of this project, which is the Future of Canada project, I have a draft of the report. I haven't published it yet, but I'm happy to probably circulate this for anybody that is interested. It's just at the draft stage. But as we're looking at this screen here, is how are the different wards, neighborhoods, hyperlocal areas, how are they engaging with on-the-ground efforts using digital tools? So what I ended up doing was going and interviewing 15 organizations with roughly about 20 people, and I have this report, and then I'm going to try and produce an op-ed out of this process. So I think the best place to start is when you think of resident engagement, the first thing you might think of is it's a group with too much time on their hands. They're more affluent, they're whiter, they're NIMBY, and they don't actually think about anything meaningful regarding change. That's pretty much the narrative you hear about every single time you open up a newspaper ad when it comes to engagement. I don't want to get into the politics of the challenges of what some groups are, but what I do want to suggest is that that's taking away from the nuance of how actual participation occurs in the city. And so what I found is that there are 10 different types of organizations. And remind you, the 15 organizations that I did talk to, it's just a snapshot. It's not a comprehensive view, but I mean, even within that, I found 10 different types. They're informal. They're not incorporated as a nonprofit. Some of them run by one person. They're formally incorporated as a nonprofit. Sometimes they have to be in order to actually make delegations to specific formal bodies like the LPAT. Some of them are citywide, focused on the entire city. Some of them are only focused on neighborhoods. Some of them are regional, like they're specifically focused on, say, Scarborough. Some are Canada-wide, but because of the way that their staff are situated, they're heavily focused on the GTA. Some are networks of community service providers and organizations. Some are federations of resident-led organizations where they banded together because they think that their voice is going to be much louder together. Some of them are community serving groups that are funded by the city. And then some are non-secular, they're faith-based institutions. So what does this tell us? It tells us that it's not just one type of engagement happening. There's lots of different organizations doing work. Now, onto the demographic side of things, if we expand our remit and our purview, we start to see that what are some of these groups focused on? Who are they focused on? The immunocompromised during the pandemic, the elderly, the unhoused, immigrants, specific demographics, and the communities that I interviewed is the Toronto, is the Canada Muslim vote. So demographics here would be Muslims, ratepayers, renters, young professionals. Not just NIMBYs, lots of people, lots of focus that's beyond just one conversation. So we need to actually think about ways that we can augment and strengthen their work. So, and building on that sort of that narrative, the argument that I'm making here is that it's not just only about development related issues. Yes, that's a massive thing. Obviously, housing is a massive thing that we face, you know, in terms of cost of living. But with the broadness of the groups, a lot of them focus on social justice and systemic inequality. A lot of them focus specifically on civic engagement and political participation. So how do we get voices inserted into the political process? How do we educate people about what different layers of government actually do? Community building and collaboration. So a lot of these groups do, you know, they put on social events and they recognize local art and they bring people together. Another one is empowerment and collective agency. Some of these groups actually give decision-making authority to the local residents, like community land trusts. You might be familiar with Kensington Market, Chinatown. Now we have Little Jamaica having one. Parkdale has one, where there's a heavy democracy focus on their organization. And then, of course, public policy and urban development. Some of these organizations, lots of them, are concerned about how to insert the voice into public policy and urban development in the different variations that it comes with, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's pro-growth and development, whether it's complete communities, and that's another topic. So we have various organizations and various issues that we're focusing on. Here is a snapshot of the tools, and it's going to be hard to look at this, and I'm happy to share the slides after, but this is just meant to capture some of the interesting digital ways that the groups try to engage residents, try to engroup their membership. So Discord, for example, More Neighbors Toronto, which is really interesting. They focus really heavily in the online space, you know, moving towards, you know, participating in person. The Chinatown Neighborhood Land Trust implemented augmented and virtual reality with seniors. That's fascinating. You don't ever hear about stories like this. I mean, I do think that there was a recent story, maybe in the Globe and Mail, that highlighted this. WhatsApp hotline for the immunocompromised. So the Good Neighbor Project, I thought this was really inspiring. During the pandemic, they formed two people, created a social media post, and then a WhatsApp hotline phone number to encourage people to volunteer to help support the immunocompromised. And within 24 hours, they had something like 2,000 volunteers. Within 30 days, they had 6,000 volunteers. So going back to the first slide about is democracy in crisis, how is it possible that two people managed to get 6,000 volunteers, but then we're also told that everyone is apathetic? There's some sort of disconnect. Clearly, what's happening on the ground within communities can be mobilized in a very meaningful way. Stone Soup created an online marketplace for mutual aid where you can actually, you can exchange vouchers for basic services and goods. And they started off in the church, basically trying to help, I believe it was asylum seekers. That spread into a mutual aid society group, and it was very heavily online. Tons of YouTube channel presentations. There's participatory film, where some of the groups, the Toronto neighborhood centers, they encourage residents to film documentaries and help them edit and publish those in their own narrative. Tons of digital letter writing, resident grant making, Equitable Action for Change, for example. They're creating an online platform to allow local community members to reach out to flag discrimination and look for resources. In-person civic forums, these happen with a lot of groups. They're meeting in person for a variety of things, where it's mayoral candidate discussions, etc. Food festivals, people-centered frameworks through community-centered research. The Parkdale People's Economy is an interesting one, where they have lots of in-person forums, and they create research based off of their conversations with residents, and then they utilize that in order to help push for social justice and equality. There's some community governance structures, which I talked about with the community land trusts. Collective position papers. FOSTRA is an example where the only way they put forward a position is that every organization, or a majority of the organizations in their federation, have to agree on that position, which is a pretty interesting take. And then everybody does everything in digital. Some of them haven't even gone back to in person. So this tells you just how important things are digitally, where we're at. One of the challenges we face is we just aren't. I mean, I study this and I work on this for a living, and I'm not even aware of all the things that's happening. Is the general public even aware of this? So one of the challenges we're facing then is cataloging this type of stuff. We need resource hubs. We need some form of framework, and I think that might be part of the conversation that I might ask the crowd to think about later, is that. But building this awareness of a more positive framework. I'm not trying to deny the little tensions that we have amongst each other as residents and the cleavages that happen, but we need to build together some form of a civic infrastructure from the ground up, and not be solely reliant on the goodwill of politicians or city council, because we know that those whims can change. So what are the challenges that they face? And these are the things that they pretty much cut across all of the groups. Some of them specifically, the real challenge was, we had a ton of volunteers during the post-pandemic. Everyone went back to work, or a lot of people couldn't devote their time. We have to sort of pivot, or some groups had to figure out ways that they've transitioned from going from in-person to digital. Now, how do we ease back into the in-person, and what does that mean? Because we had to switch so many things. Trust building is the number one, probably one of the number one things that these groups are trying to establish within their communities, is how you actually build trust amongst people, how you build trust among people with different opinions. And that's a big one that I think that we need to focus on. Succession planning is also an interesting one, because some of these groups are aging, or some of these groups don't want to be in leadership forever. How do you build an effective, equitable succession plan? The volunteer times and costs. Inflation has gone up. We heard problems about volunteering and what it means to actually travel. Transportation costs for driving and whatnot. Just all of these things add up. Budgets and fundraising for these local groups. Some of these groups are very small teams. They're not paid. They're volunteers. You have to be able to figure out ways to actually, support some of your efforts. Digital divides. Obviously, one of the big challenges is that there are digital divides. Some of it's geographical, some of it's age-based and demographic-based, racially based, and challenges focus on immigrant communities. And so how do we actually build those digital divides up? Some of the ways that they did this, for example, the Scarborough Civic Action Network, they create community segues, where basically that they build relationships with local leaders to help them translate and build connections on the ground. How to set up formal structures. Believe it or not, it's not as easy as you might think in terms of just creating an organization. How do you create a board? How do you do these things? So I think these are like, some groups need frameworks to be able to do this, to help them do this. And then of course, a big one is inter-resident group dissension. That might be too much words to describe conflict between organizations, because there are plenty of those. Effective constructive social media. Some people will completely shy away from the civic infrastructure that exists. The Nextdoor app. so many people refuse to use that because of the bad name it has in terms of racial profiling. And it exists in Toronto, the network. So that's one civic tech tool that might not be leveraged because of the bad name that it has. Dealing with scale, cost of rental space. You want to hold, and I mean, I don't know if I'm sure there's probably similar challenges even with Civic Tech Toronto, but some groups have to pay, you know, $400 or $500 for insurance to be able to rent a venue to host a public event with the public. Creating these arduous barriers for people to actually, you know, organize in the community. Disconnection in silos. You know, there's, you know, some of these groups are connected, but across the city, not so much. And then political and city staff relations, it really is tenuous. It depends on the community. Some are a little bit more savvy than others. So some of the, you know, the three main questions that I focused on here were, how do we build trust, establish truth, and how do we weather crises? And how are these groups doing it? And so the way that I saw that they actually achieve these is they build trust through a variety of community building exercises, collective decision-making, and the promotion of local events. They establish truth in a variety of ways, actually, is that by they host forums to educate residents on, you know, mayoral candidate positions or on, you know, different layers of governance, or they do it from a lived experience lens where they actually go out and establish the truths of people living within their communities, and they report on those. And they deal with crises in a variety of different ways, helping through mutual aid. One thing that I thought was interesting is that some of these organizations that formed in the pandemic were actually working closely with the City of Toronto to help with a vaccination program. So that's another way of dealing with weathering crisis, is drawing upon the social capital within communities. So what can tools achieve and what they can't? I mean, so these are just two quotes, and just to give you the short end of it, in one sense, people want some form of centralized resource to be able to draw upon. And the reason for that is, one, it will help all organizations, but on the flip side, it will help specifically those organizations that might not have the resources and might be lacking in terms of the connections and power that they might have. So how do we level the playing field? And then in another sense is, you can't utilize technology solely in placement of building trust. You have to build trust as your exercise first, and let technology help leverage and achieve that as well, not replace that mechanism. So here are some of the interventions, and then followed by the recommendations that I have. So the interventions, I mean, if we just think about what are all the things that we would want, and this is only some of them, to our engagement interventions that focus on digital tools or in-person tools. We want them to help quality of life and social well-being. There's got to be some end game to the, you know, these processes. People are clearly focused on big ticket issues, affordability, inequality. Interventions need to focus on things like that. We want to help find ways to actually encourage people from being passive to active, and different variations of that. Informed decision-making. So we don't just want free-for-all conversations that are echo chambers. We want them to be informed conversations based on a variety of different information and positions. We want people to work across boundaries, because that's how you actually build a framework, an infrastructure that can rely upon each other. And then at some point, we do need to talk about formal supports within the city, even if those aren't necessarily something that are realistic. We can still come up with and try to encourage those relationships. So the 4 recommendations that I have are, we need to map local civic opportunities to build connections. I think a great starting point is tango.to. Many of you might be familiar with that. It's a great geographical framework. I just think that we can build that out further. We can map organizations, we can create resource hubs, we can create resource tools, we can figure out ways to actually have a visualization and a central resource hub of some sort that civic tech falls into it. I'm thinking public evaluation of resident engagement would be an interesting thing to do. Public evaluation being, anyone that goes to a public event has the opportunity to rate their experience. You can go to a restaurant and rate your experience. You can't go to a city council meeting or a public forum and rate your experience. So one thing that we've been piloting at our Center for Democracy Innovation is giving people that opportunity to provide critical feedback on their experience at various public-facing events. Establish citywide resident-driven problem framing. I think there needs to be a way for all of us to have some opportunity to frame problems that are important to us and to have meaningful conversations in a way that bridges divides, in a way that goes against the common narrative that I presented at the very beginning about democracy in crisis. And then lastly, we need to institutionalize participation from the top down. So we want to work our way from the bottom up. What are the different interesting ways? Participatory budgeting, citizens assemblies, civic tech, asynchronous participation, whatever those are. And I think there's a lot of tools that folks in this community know of that I don't know of could be useful. You know, poll.is, open source forms of conversation are interesting ways, and beyond that. And so I think, these are some of the recommendations that I think we can start to work on. But I mean, specifically, the Civic Tech Toronto community might really have an opportunity to build and map local opportunities and connections as a resource. That's where I see the community, utilizing your skill sets to create that, and building upon tango.to to be something more expansive. And that's it.